Welcome back to the Wild Robot Escapes, Chapter 19 to 24. Chapter 19, The Storytellers. Roz and the children had a new routine. Several times a week, they'd gather beneath the oak tree and Roz would tell stories about the robot on the island. The children loved hearing about how the robot survived mudslides and bear attacks and harsh winter weather. They loved hearing how she befriended the island animals. But the stories they loved most were about the robot and her son, the goose. He sounded like such a nice goose. Roz told the children story after story after story. What she didn't tell them, what she couldn't tell them, was that the stories were true and that they were about her. The children wanted to get in on the storytelling fun, so Jaya told adventure stories about dragons and monsters. Jade told silly stories about aliens in outer space. But as the children grew more comfortable with Roz, they began talking about their own lives. They talked about growing up way out in the country. They talked about their schoolmates and their friends and their family. They talked about how their parents used to work together around the farm and how perfect everything was before the accident. In an instant, their lives were upended. Their mother was gone and their father was injured. Mr. Sherif tried to keep the farm going by himself, but there was so much to do, and he was so weak now. The farm machines powered along, doing their jobs as usual, but they needed to be maintained and monitored. Eventually, the machines started breaking down and the farm started failing. The children wondered if life would ever feel normal again. "That's why we got you, Roz," said the girl. "We needed you to save this place." "And that's exactly what you're doing," said the boy with a smile. Chapter 20, The Wild Animals. Wildlife can be very good for farmland. Insects pollinate the plants. Snakes eat the pests. Droppings of the rodents and birds and every other animal act as natural fertilizer. Roz wanted more of these helpful creatures on the farm, so she let the unused sections of land go wild. Up from the ground emerged native weeds and flowers, woody brambles, and with the wild plants came the wild animals. But then some creatures came skulking around, who were not helpful at all. It started when Roz noticed a heavy scent floating on the breeze. She followed the scent to a narrow strip of the forest on the edge of the property. There were clumps of fur in the undergrowth and claw marks in the dirt. There was blood, too, lots of it. And then she found the carcass. A deer had recently been killed and eaten. The robot's head slowly spun around as she scanned the area. Not far from the carcass was a pile of droppings. It looked like it might have been from a dog, but Oscar wasn't large enough or ferocious enough to kill a deer. What kind of animal could have done this? Roz had been standing there at the edge of the property for a while. She imagined Mr. Sherif in his office, sitting at his computer, eyeing her location on a map. Any minute now, he would hobble out to his truck and come racing down the driveway to check on her. Roz didn't want to upset the man, so she left the carcass where it was, and she returned to her work. But from then on, she kept a careful eye for any other signs of trouble. Chapter 21, The Howl. It wasn't long before Roz found more signs of trouble. Furry faces poking out of the bushes, musky smells lingering in the fields, silhouettes trotting through the moonlight. And then one night she heard it, the long, menacing howl of the wolf. Chapter 22, The Wolves. The attack happened at dusk. 7 beastly shapes bounded over the fence and into the pasture. Old Annabelle had wandered off from the herd, and now she made an easy target. The herding machine saw the wolves coming and rolled in their direction, but the hunters were clever. They split up and they darted past the clunky machine and they surrounded their target. The wolf pack was led by a single large male. His name was Shadow. It was easy to see why. He was quick and quiet and covered in dark fur, except for the long pale scar that streaked across his body like a comet. Shadow locked eyes with the cow. distracting her with his fierce gaze. And when his pack was in position, he said, "Attack!" The wolves lunged, snapping their jaws at the cow's skinny legs. Annabelle kicked and hollered, "Stay away from me, you brutes!" She was a big animal, but the wolves knew what to do. They kept biting her, kept taunting her, and kept wearing her down. The herd watched from afar, and they cried out to their friend. They wanted to help, but they were too frightened to move. Well, reader, you can guess who came to the rescue. Footsteps thundered across the pasture, and Roz leaped into the fight. Had she swung her fists or kicked her feet, the wolf pack might have fled. But the robot wasn't programmed to be violent. All she could do was awkwardly defend the cow. Roz felt teeth chomping her arm, and she felt claws slashing her chest. Her pain sensors flared, and she howled, "Leave us alone!" The robot's booming voice startled the wolves, and in an instant she pried one of them away. And then Annabelle landed a hard kick, and another wolf tumbled backwards into the grass. More help was coming. The other cows had finally found their courage, and the angry herd was on the march. The wolves had missed their chance. Shadow gave a frustrated grunt, and the pack retreated. They dashed through the pasture, leaped over the fence, and they disappeared into the trees. The robot activated her headlights, and shafts of light beamed out of her eyes. While the herd crowded around, Roz carefully examined all of Annabelle's injuries. "I need to clean and dress those bite wounds," she said, "but you will be okay." "Of course I'll be okay," the old cow panted. "I'm old, but I'm feisty. Those wolves don't scare me." Annabelle talked tough, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. All of the cows were afraid now. They knew that if the wolves attacked again, their next victim might not be so fortunate. Chapter 23. The Rifle. The wolves returned the very next morning, shortly after dawn, and they leaped from the trees and they started chasing a poor calf through the pasture. Roz managed to drive them off, but that night they returned again. The herd came stampeding into the barn as the wolves laughed and trotted back to the field. The cows were in shock. They refused to leave the barn, and if this continued, the herd would produce less milk, the farm would lose money, and Mr. Sherif, he would send Roz back to the factory. Something had to be done. Knock, knock, knock. The dog barked, and the children opened the door. "How'd you get all those scrapes?" said Jaya. "Is everything okay?" said Jade. "I must speak with your father," said Roz. Mr. Sherif came to the door. Roz explained the problem. At first mention of the wolves, he sent his children to their rooms, but the dog stayed. Oscar had no idea what the man and the robot were discussing, and his tail happily wagged as he stood beside them. However, his tail stopped wagging when Mr. Sherif handed Roz the rifle. The dog had seen a rifle in action, and it frightened him to his core. He scurried into the bushes and he hid there, whimpering while the conversation went on. "What do you mean you can't fire a rifle?" the man yelled. "Roz, you're a farmer now, and sometimes farmers have to kill animals." It was the first time Mr. Sherif had ever yelled at Roz. She waited patiently as words and spit flew from his mouth. "My farm and my family are in danger. Roz, I order you to kill those wolves." "I cannot follow that order because I am not programmed to be violent." Mr. Sherif let out a heavy sigh. He knew Roz was right, but when he reached for the weapon, she wouldn't let go. The man stared at the robot stared at the dog stared at the rifle. Oscar was still whimpering and hiding in the bushes. Just the sight of the rifle had sent him into a panic. It was hard to believe that such a fearful animal was related to wolves, but dogs are related to wolves, thought the robot, and her computer brain began buzzing with activity. She thought of dogs and wolves and rifles. She thought of Shadow the wolf leader, and the long straight scar on his side, and then she had an idea. "Although I cannot fire the rifle," said Roz, "I believe it can help me solve the wolf problem." Mr. Sherry frowned. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what the robot was getting at, but he was happy to let her handle the wolves all by herself. "Fine, try it your way," he said. "Just don't lose any cows, or else we will have to lose a robot too." Chapter 24, The Bluff. The cows peered out of the barn at Roz. The robot was holding the rifle. She carried it to the far side of the pasture and placed it by her feet. Then she began coating herself with mud and grass, probably a little cow dung. With every inch of her body concealed, she nestled down into the ground and became part of the landscape, an ordinary clump of grass. The cows were stunned. "What is Roz doing? Is she all right? Where did she go?" Roz had learned to camouflage herself back on the island, and now she was using that trick once again. She sat motionless for hours, waiting for the wolves to appear. Daylight faded, the stars came out, the moon climbed into the sky, but the wolves didn't show up. So Roz tried something new. The robot was an excellent mimic, and she began crying out at the sad voice of a wounded calf. "Please help me. I have hurt my leg and I cannot move." Crickets chirped. "Please help me." An owl hooted. "I cannot move." The calf's voice continued crying out. Finally, as the moon dipped behind the trees, 7 wolves slunk into the pasture. Shadow led the way, silently stalking through the night. Covered with dark fur, he was practically invisible. Only his long pale scar gave him away. Nose sniffed, eyes searched, ears listened. Then a clump of grass began rustling. "There," said Shadow. "The calf is hiding in the tall grass." "Something feels wrong to me, Shadow," said a female. "This is too easy." "I make the decisions, Barb," snapped the wolf leader. "Lash, Lurk, Fang, circle around and wait for my signal." 3 wolves dashed off, and when they were in position, Shadow gave the signal, and his pack closed in on the wounded calf. With each step, the grass rustled more and more, until the ground seemed to be moving. And then the ground really was moving. Grass and dirt crumbled aside, and there was the robot, standing tall, pointing the rifle at the wolf's leader. The pack froze. "Hello, Shadow," growled the robot. "My name is Roz. I see from your scar that you are familiar with rifles. You have been shot before. You know what will happen if I pull the trigger." Reader, you and I are well aware that our robot was not programmed to be violent. Roz couldn't have pulled the trigger if she wanted to. But she didn't want to. She was bluffing. Of course, Shadow didn't know any of this. As far as we knew, he was defeated. And so he did what wolves do when they're defeated. He lay down and he cowered before the robot. For the first time anyone could recall, the wolf leader looked weak. "I do not want to hurt any wolves," Roz continued. "But if you return to this farm, I will have no choice. Now please leave and never come back." Shadow scrambled away with his tail between his legs. Barb was close behind him, followed by the other wolves, and soon the entire pack had disappeared into the night.